Hi everyone, I'm Megan Benton. I'm the Research Director for MPI Europe. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this webinar on seasonal worker programs in Europe, lessons learned and ways forward. I'm just going to get the housekeeping notes out the way first. So the audio from today's webinar will be on our website later today. For any technical problems, you should email events@migrationpolicy.org. If you have problems hearing, we suggest that you dial in using the call-in information you'll have on your email confirmation. And then finally, we're going to have a written, not a voice Q&A at the end of the call. So you can start preparing your questions now and type them into the Q&A or chat box on the right of your screen. Or you can email them at events@migrationpolicy.org or even tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy. This webinar is highlighting findings from our new report, Seasonal Worker Programs in Europe, by Kate Hooper and Camila Koz. That's on our website, and the link is on your screens right now. But we're going to discuss the implications more broadly today. So when we think about seasonal workers, we often focus on the stereotype of Polish agricultural workers in the UK or Germany, Thai berry pickers in Sweden, Mexican farm workers in the US Midwest on this side of the Atlantic. But seasonal work isn't just about the patterns or different groups in different sectors. It's really an issue that's at the heart of how you build well-functioning immigration systems that meet the economic interests of receiving societies, but also support individual migrants, protect them from exploitation and abuse, and also reduce the incentives for illegality and informality across the migration spectrum. Now, in Europe in particular, there's been a lot of interest in recent years about whether legal migration pathways, including seasonal worker programs, can begin to attract and divert people who might otherwise come through irregular routes. So we're also very pleased today to be showcasing some of the findings from a really ambitious, deeply thoughtful project on this topic, which is called Legal Migration for Work and Training, Mobility Options to Europe for Those Not in Need of Protection. This is led by the Expert Council of German Foundations on Integration and Migration, or SVR for short, as well as the Migration Policy Institute Europe, and it's funded by the MacArthur Foundation. So we have some great speakers on the line today. We have my colleague Kate Hooper, who is a policy analyst at MPI, and she co-authored the brief that we're launching today, as well as the bigger report that we were a part of. And then Jan Schneider, he's the head of the research unit at SVR, who led the work on their side, as well as Stephanie Maurel, who is the CEO of Concordia. Now, before I hand over to Kate, I just wanted to set out a few framing questions. So I mentioned that the sort of hook for today's webinar is that we're discussing the implementation of the Seasonal Workers Directive. The goal of that is really to harmonize the rules on seasonal worker programs in Europe, to curb illegal employment, to protect workers' rights, but also to start to think about development benefits for countries of origin. As I said, there's a sort of interest in European countries about whether seasonal worker programs can be one small piece of the answer to how you ultimately reduce incentives for irregular migration. So there's an important shift here to thinking about how these programs can be a sensible migration management strategy, not just an economic one. It's also a very important moment for the UK as it considers how to sort of soften the impact of Brexit on particular sectors that rely on free movement and the kind of closing of the low-skilled migration channel. So I'm really excited that we have Stephanie on the line, who's going to talk about how Concordia is managing the new UK pilot program for seasonal workers, which is one of the successors to the pre-Brexit free movement system. But I think that a lot of countries are facing the same big questions here, which are, how can these programs be designed to minimize exploitation and abuse, and what protections need to be in place to protect local workers? How can we make sure that these programs respond to labor needs in a timely fashion, especially when there are so many factors that are unpredictable, whether they're other forms of migration, the weather, climate, the economic cycle, all makes the scale and location of labor needs quite difficult to predict. How can we cut red tape and shorten the length of time that it takes to hire people under these programs so they act as an incentive for employers to hire legally above board rather than going through informal routes, especially a problem in countries that already have a pool of rejected asylum seekers or visa overstayers contributing to that workforce? And then a sort of undernoted area is, to what extent should we be thinking about the integration of temporary seasonal workers? Are they able to build skills they can use if and when they return home? Are there any implications to people coming back year in, year out? So we're going to turn to Kate first for some thoughtful reflections on these questions. As I said, Kate is a policy analyst with MPI's international program, and she works primarily on labour migration as well as a host of other smart topics. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks, Megan. So as you mentioned, the brief that we're discussing today sprang out of our research project with SVR, which looked at pathways for low and middle skilled migrants to move to Europe. And we had some case studies on France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Sweden, which I highly recommend looking at. So during the course of our research, we found that seasonal work was often a key pathway for low-skilled workers to move to Europe. Each country had its own very interesting history of seasonal migration. So, as you mentioned, some countries like Germany and the UK have really relied on recruiting seasonal workers from Eastern European countries. Other countries like Spain and France also actively recruit workers from non-EU countries like Morocco. And then, as you mentioned, the very interesting case of Sweden, where they rely on recruiting berry pickers from Thailand, which seemed like a more unusual pathway. And so three lessons from our research, which really focused on this sort of non-EU migrants moving to Europe for seasonal work. I think the first lesson from our research was that recruitment procedures need to be transparent, standardized, and responsive. So the two issues here are that, first, when you're looking at industries like agriculture or hospitality that rely on seasonal workers, you often don't have that much advance warning, either of the numbers of workers or the timing that you need these workers for. So there's a real need for sort of policies that can swiftly admit workers to meet these needs and that can scale up or down as needed. And then the second issue was that some of these programs really rely on informal word-of-mouth processes to hire workers, which isn't inherently bad, but moving towards sort of more formalized procedure allows greater insight. So some principles for consideration from our work is to really think about the scope to simplify these recruitment procedures. So, for example, allowing employers who play by the rules to access expedited recruitment, making sure that it's transparent and easy for employers and workers to navigate, and then exploring ways to open up new recruitment channels. So, for example, investing in partner countries and really building that capacity for local employment agencies. A second lesson from our research was to prioritize better worker protections by really investing in monitoring and outreach. So the issue here was that seasonal workers can be especially vulnerable to exploitation. So this is linked to the short-term, labor-intensive nature of their work, which in the cases of fruit and vegetable picking, for example, can be in quite remote locations, and also their limited ties to the country. So there's, for example, maybe a lack of host country language skills. There's also sometimes an emphasis in these programs on recruiting female seasonal workers with families back home. So Spain has pioneered this approach, partly to try and reduce the incidence of visa overstays. The idea being that if you pick someone who has clear ties back in their country of origin, they're less likely to overstay. But one of the sort of unexpected consequences of that policy decision is that you've got this group who are now at particular risk of gender-based violence and abuse. So some principles for consideration here are that increased monitoring and oversight in destination countries really needs to be a priority. So you need more resources for inspections and also ensuring that there's awareness of the particular vulnerabilities of this group. Pre-departure orientations can also really help set expectations for seasonal workers on their working conditions and the services available to them. And it's also key to invest in services that can offer advice and support to seasonal workers, but also to think about how accessible these services are for seasonal workers, especially those who might be working in remote settings, and also whether there needs to be more tailored support for certain groups, such as female seasonal workers. And then finally, another consideration is to think about what existing protections are in place. So the Seasonal Workers Directive that you mentioned earlier has provisions for seasonal workers to switch employers. This is a really useful mechanism for a seasonal worker to escape poor working conditions. But I think that we need to explore the extent to which this really can be used by workers who are on such short-term contracts and who also may lack the networks to find new employment. And then a third and final lesson is to really capitalize on the opportunities to tap the development benefits of seasonal migration for workers in their communities. So currently, there are some opportunities for skills development, but these are really focused on equipping workers to perform their roles. Generally, we found there is much less attention paid to what skills seasonal workers could put to use when they return home and ways to potentially support workers in their communities. So here you could consider the following principles. One would be to link up remittances to local development plans and opportunities to save, invest, or access remittance-based loans, so fitting into sort of broader development practices here. Another option is to explore more concrete options for skills development, whether this is linked to the role that they're working in, so ways to upskill, or broader training opportunities, so things like host country language tuition, literacy, numeracy training, or other life skills like driving or IT skills that are more generally applicable. Here, of course, the issue is that there are really tight profit margins in some of these industries. So employers may be reluctant or just simply unable to offer this type of add-on skills training, especially if you're hiring someone for only a few months at a time. But here, one interesting example is Australia and New Zealand, where development agencies have funded this type of support. So they have sort of provided this as an add-on service, really sort of to emphasize the development benefits here. And another option is to even explore whether member states who are recruiting from the same countries could even band together to offer this type of service. So here it's a sort of new field, but I think it offers potentially a nice opportunity to really leverage the development benefits of migration and to sort of locate seasonal migration into broader labour migration and development strategies.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate, for really talking us through the nuts and bolts of some of the design questions with these programs, but also leaving us with some of those really provocative new ideas on how to harness the development benefits of these programs. This is often seen as the kind of holy grail of these programs, but there's rarely a sort of concrete plan of action of actually how to, harness these benefits. So there's some really smart ideas that this brief has put on the table, so thank you. I'm going to turn next to Jan Schneider, who is the head of the research unit at SVR, and he's been leading on this project on the SVR side. He's going to talk a little bit today about seasonal migration to Germany. Thank you for joining us, Jan, and over to you.
Hello, everybody, and good afternoon from Berlin. Happy to be online here, and thank you, Kate, for really putting in a nutshell the result of part of our joint project here. It has been a real pleasure working on that with you. I would like to give you in the upcoming 4 or 5 minutes an overview on the situation of seasonal employment in Germany, part of what I'm referring to are results from a recent separate study that I did on the foreign workforce of the German food production industry financed by the Open Society Foundations. I will focus on seasonal work in agriculture, which is by far the most important sector for seasonal work in Germany. The agricultural field accounts for slightly less than 1% of the German GDP, and it accounts for about 1.3% of the total workforce in Germany. That's slightly below 1 million people, just to give you an idea. And annually, there is about 300,000 seasonal workers employed for periods between 2 and 4 months in Germany on fields in agriculture, mostly in harvesting. Traditionally, Polish migration has been the most important source for labor migration, besides household members who have traditionally been helping in harvesting, particularly women and children. But the Polish migration has been going on for 200 years already to Western Germany. Now, looking at the more recent history, for the past 25 or so years, the number of seasonal workers, as I mentioned before, has ranged at about 300,000 per season. Until around about the year 2004, 2005, the share of Polish nationals was about 85% of those workers. But ever since, it has dropped to less than half of the seasonal worker population over the last 10 or 15 years. with basically Romanian nationals taking over and being the biggest group in recent years. There are further rather small quotas of nationals from Bulgaria, Croatia, Hungary, and most recently also Serbia. So before accession of the Middle and Eastern European states, Poland and Romania, as third countries to Germany, were subject to bilateral agreements with the German Federal Employment Agency, and there was actually a well-rehearsed practice of registering potential need for workers on the side of the German agricultural enterprises. And there was a well-rehearsed practice of partner employment agencies in the countries of origin, Poland and Romania primarily, vetting candidates for a pool of workers to be referred to Germany. During that time, there was hardly any shortage of labor, as the system could be managed precisely and labor supply was sheer endless. Of course, this had a downside to it. A lot of reports on substandard labor conditions or exploitative work relationships were there, or sometimes there were even no reports at all. We had sort of an underreporting and also not a lot of research going on in that area, which is basically never a good sign for workers' rights. Seasonal workers in Germany have not been subject to any collective bargaining agreements. It was externally, the trade unions were not responsible for them. And remember that there was no minimum wage in Germany until the year 2015. So a little bit sarcastically put, we could talk about an agri-employer's paradise regarding these third country, at the time, third country seasonal workers. So then I would like to refer, and this is my almost last point, to two mega trends and developments. And the first of which was the accession of Poland in 2004, which was factually extended using the transitional period of 7 years. So ever since 2011, Poland has a full labor mobility towards Germany, as has Romania since 2014. And the second mega trend or mega development was the introduction of the minimum wage in 2015, which started at an amount of slightly above 7 euros per hour and is now slightly above 9 euros per hour in Germany. This compares to wages being paid in German agriculture before that time of about 4, 5, or maybe 5.50 euros per hour. So you can see from that fact alone that there is a higher cost pressure on the side of agri-producers in Germany. Free labor movement made other sectors much more attractive to the Polish and the Romanian workforce. So agricultural enterprises were facing recruitment problems, particularly in recent years. And as a side effect or a consequence of the higher cost pressure on the side of producers, the problem of unfair labor conditions didn't go away. On the contrary, we see some more tricks coming up, like cutting working hours or paying for materials and tools to be used in harvesting, overpriced housing for the people who sleep for the season close to the field. And we have seen misuse of internship programs with Ukrainians and Russian students who would come to help on the field. My last point may be to refer to the potential developmental aspects of seasonal work in Germany. Actually, this is often also among migration researchers faced with the prejudice that it is just about making use of the labor force, so to speak, exploiting people, exploiting diligent people who perform hard work without actually giving them any skills or having them acquire the means to contribute to development back home, so to speak. And this is true in a lot of cases and has been true in a lot of cases regarding Germany, but there are also good examples of the opposite. Now I'd like to only give you one or two of these examples. Provided that climate and soil are suitable, which definitely is the case in Poland as a huge country very close to Germany. In recent years, and we're speaking about 5 to 10 years, there's new asparagus cultures rapidly growing in Poland, where asparagus was hardly heard of 20 years ago, so they weren't actually consuming it over there. Right now, some of those workers have taken with them the knowledge and the skills to start and also harvest these rather complicated cultures of agricultural produce. And the second example is apple cultures. Poland would be apt to provide Germany and lots of Europe with quality and particular varieties of apples, and they are starting this business right now. My last point, given the shortage of seasonal workers on the fields in the last few years, there has been an extreme lobbying for new placement agreements with third countries, as we practically don't have them right now. And as we speak, it seems that the Federal Employment Agency is about to conclude an agreement with Georgia, an important country of origin for applicants of international protection. Just as a side note on the linkage of legal pathways, to work with irregular migration into the asylum procedure, as Georgians have very little chances of being recognized under protection standards. And we're seeing the Federal Employment Agency negotiating other agreements right now with third countries, although the scope of these programs seems to be rather low for the moment, in the area of several hundreds per year. But we'll have to wait and see and safeguard within the contents of these programs that labor rights are safeguarded, that swift recruitment procedures and transparent mechanisms are in place, and that support and counseling structures improve further and inspections be picked up on the situation of laborers on the field.
Thank you so much, Jan. That asparagus example is such a terrific example of knowledge transfer and the potential win-win of seasonal and circular migration. Also made me feel a bit hungry, having not had breakfast. But I also really liked the way that you took us through the history of seasonal work in Germany. It's a great reminder that EU accession wasn't kind of the beginning of this, but there was actually a really well-developed infrastructure in place. So thank you very much for your comments. Before I turn to Stephanie, I just, in case any of you have already been collecting questions, I just wanted to remind you again about how you can send those across. So for those of you who don't have a screen in front of you, basically you can write to events@migrationpolicy.org, or you can use the chat function, or you can tweet @migrationpolicy. I am now going to turn to Stephanie Maurel, who is the CEO of Concordia, which is the largest seasonal labour provider to the agricultural sector and a charity. And it is managing the new seasonal workers pilot in the UK. So really pleased to have you, Stephanie, and over to you.
Hi, so I'm Stephanie Maurel, and I'm Chief Executive of Concordia. So we are a charity, we're a not-for-profit, and we've been going for 77 years, and we're the biggest seasonal labour provider in the UK. And that means we work with about 200 farms every year and can bring in up to this year, about 10,000 workers, generally from Eastern Europe, to work on UK farms. We've done that, again, up until last year from Eastern Europe, so mainly Romania, Bulgaria. So what Jan was saying was ringing bells. We also have Lithuania and Latvia. Interestingly, a handful of Polish workers. We've really pulled away from there. We have 90,000 seasonal roles that need filling every year in the UK, and for the past 3 years in a row, we've had 10 to 12% shortage across the whole of the sector in agriculture in the UK. So that's about 10,000 workers and 10,000 jobs unfilled, which meant that there's a lot of very strong lobbying of the government for a scheme that would allow us to look outside the EU to find different workers and to access a new market. Now, Brexit is one word that I was hoping to avoid, so it's not just linked to Brexit. However, Brexit and the feelings of workers within Europe to the UK, as well as their other opportunities and what else is going on, meant that we were pushed towards the cliff edge of needing access to a new route to labour a lot more quickly potentially than we would have done otherwise. The British government very much listened and trusted the sector to be able to run a pilot, a 2-year pilot which started December 2018, when the British government announced 2,500 workers could be recruited from outside the EU, and a licence was granted to Concordia as one of the operators of the licence, and to another commercial company to run the other half, split 50-50. We were recruiting 1,250, as were the other company. We were given 3 measures. The first measure is that 95% of all of our workers need to get a visa, so on us to make sure that we recruit from countries where we could get those interviews done properly and get the motivation of the individuals right. 97% of all those that got a visa had to arrive at their place of employment, so at the farm, and 97% of all of those that came to the UK had to go back to their country of origin at the end of this 6-month visa. So specifically a 6-month visa to work in edible horticulture. And that was it. That was the programme. We filled in our response to the tender, and very much our response to the tender was how we choose to run the pilot for ourselves. So we have decided to ensure that workers came over with basic English for health and safety reasons, although we've been so overwhelmed by response to the pilot that actually we have individuals coming through very highly motivated, very qualified, and with really very good English. We have recruited from 3 countries specifically last year. That was Russia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And we've added this year Georgia, Belarus, and Barbados to those 3 countries. We worked with 24 farms. And interestingly, because we are a not-for-profit, we have a major focus on the worker themselves. So we do provide free training in language skills where necessary, in maths and IT. We do support funding for training in terms of supervisory roles, campsite warden roles, driving, spraying, that type of thing to try and support them a little bit more when the workers come over. We are known as being the leader in worker welfare in the UK. So in that sense, we do an awful lot to ensure that the whole of the supply chain that we work with is as clean as it possibly can be and risks are limited to the minimum. Every single farm that has work on this pilot is audited twice. We have a full-time employee whose role is to audit every single farm once, and everyone else gets the team that are office-based will also go out and audit for the second time. That involves worker surveys, independently done by an external company as well as done internally to gather feedback. We have focus groups. We check for labour abuse. We check for modern slavery. We also have what we call our pastoral funds. So one of our drivers for our charity is to ensure that we foster cross-cultural relationships. So we ensure that farms where these workers are have access to a fund which can allow money to be spent on anything linked to understanding more about different culture. So that could be a trip to a theme park, to a local town, to London, to wherever, or it could be investment into potentially picnic benches, football kits, markings on the ground so that workers can play volleyball in their time off. So we very much drive the wraparound support for workers. And because we work with so many farms, the 200 that I mentioned, workers can also be transferred very, very easily where necessary, either through potentially a clash in values between the individual and the farm, or more likely when weather has meant that workers come to an end prematurely, we can move workers to another farm and thus guarantee as much as we can a full 6 months of work under that visa. The extension that you may or may not have seen came from the British government last Wednesday. So our Home Secretary announced an amendment and an update to the immigration policy, which included a strapline, which was an extension of this pilot specifically for edible horticulture from 2,500 workers to 10,000 workers. So as of last Wednesday, Concordia is now finding half that amount from the 6 countries that I mentioned earlier. And my final thing to mention in terms of the pilot is the measures. Concordia has absolutely nailed them. We have workers, every single worker on a visa, for example. There's been no issues at all in our measures back to the government. One of the things that has come out in terms of worker welfare as part of this programme is that where the British government has its own embassy and visa office stacked and employing British staff, the access to the visa is free. There's no cost for an appointment. There's no cost for passports to be sent to individuals, etc. In all countries bar Russia that we are working in, the actual visa office has been contracted out to a private firm, and there are costs linked to this. So, for example, you could be paying €50 just to get into a building to have your fingerprints taken in order to apply for the visa. So we're looking at this very closely to see which country we would choose to work with in order to make sure that the workers really do pay absolutely nothing apart from their travel over to the UK and the individual visa cost, but the wraparound costs linked to commercial companies are reduced to the maximum.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was a really brilliant and so great to hear about the detailed work that you're doing, including the focus on worker rights and the supply chain. And thanks also for situating this in context around the broader sort of shortages that this sector is facing. We already have a ton of questions that have come in, so we're going to do our best to get through all of them. But just before we start allocating them to the different speakers, I just wanted to remind everyone of how you can ask questions. There's a Q&A chat function on the right of the screen, or you can write events@migrationpolicy.org, or you can tweet at migrationpolicy. The first question is about the best tools for addressing exploitation, and Stephanie talked a lot about this. So I was wondering if, Jan, you could share some of the best initiatives that exist in Germany on that front.
Yeah, pleasure. This was actually part of that research I was referring to. There is a number of tools to curb exploitation, although in the area of having controls and checks on the field, there is special authorities in each member state responsible for labor inspections. In Germany, it's called Finanzkontrolle Schwarzarbeit. It's part of the Central Customs Authority. And one of their major tasks with a workforce of up to 10,000 people in the coming years is to have regular inspections on the black labor market, not only with regards to irregular employment of foreign nationals, but also with regard to tax fraud and the withholding of social security contributions. So one of the frequently asked for measures and tools is to just step up with these inspections, which the agency is actually doing, but it turns out that particularly in the agricultural field, it is difficult to safeguard that because, for instance, if compared to the sector of construction, where you can easily access construction sites of new buildings, also close down the area around it to do the inspections and controls and look for workers' papers, it's much more difficult in the countryside to access remote fields of entrepreneurs. A second example, which really has been subject to a lot of development in Germany, has been bottom-up and with the help of trade unions and counseling services at the level of the federal states, the 16 federal states, for instance, there has been a very good infrastructure of counseling and support services built up for these migrant workers, particularly, of course, for those coming from other EU countries, including counseling in mother tongues, language of origin, including legal advice, including legal professionals who would go for a settlement if there was a quarrel between a dispute between an employer and their employees. However, the system as it functioned until recently, or is still functioning, is not easy to be controlled because everybody is free movers and people organize their stay in Germany either by themselves or by the employers, or even more so by dubious agencies in countries of origin, in Romania and Poland. And there's dozens of agencies, some of them are doing a decent job with very low referral fees, but others also starting to exploit workers as they apply for a position in German agriculture. So I would see that a lot of room for maneuver for future development there, also from the side of the responsible state authorities to do more on the front of reducing and eventually eradicating exploitative work relationships.
Thank you, Jan. Kate, we have a question here about the rates of return and absconding. What are the steps that governments can take to make sure that seasonal workers don't overstay their visa or disappear into the informal economy?
Sure. So I think during the course of our research, we came across a few different approaches which had some advantages and trade-offs. So I think one general point is that you need to look at the factors that are really linked to overstays. So one common issue is that if a worker has accrued debt by moving to a country for seasonal work, they need to be able to pay that off. And so that can be one of the challenges. So thinking about whether, for example, you could require employers to cover some of these travel expenses so workers have less debt and are less liable to pay this off as a result. Some countries have tried to really track returns by requiring returning migrants to register in their country of origin. So Spain and France have both done this. So France, I think, is with one of their local offices in the country. Spain's with the relevant embassy, but that allows you to really sort of track when people are leaving and when people are coming back. I think another approach is really to sort of try and create incentives to play by the rules. So France, building on its requirement to that migrants register in their country of origin, they've really prioritized the rehiring of workers who've already been to France and come back and registered. So there's a sort of reward if you play by the rules, and so there's an incentive there, both for employers who might want to hire the same workers for multiple seasons and for the workers themselves to, stick to the rules. New Zealand, outside of Europe, New Zealand has a policy of holding employers liable for the costs of removing workers who overstay. So that's quite an interesting approach where there's a clear sort of financial penalty for employers if they don't keep on top of returns. And then, as I mentioned earlier, another approach that Spain has tried is to try and select certain profiles of seasonal workers. So looking at sort of female seasonal workers with families back home. But as I mentioned, this kind of raises other issues. So obviously there's a sort of ethical consideration of separating a parent from their family for several months at a time. And then there's also the documented incidents of gender-based violence and abuse against female seasonal workers. So that sort of brings up another sort of host of challenges.
Thank you very much, Kate. Stephanie, we have a question here about whether the sort of Concordia model can be seen anywhere else, whether anyone's tried to replicate it in the rest of Europe. Are there any similar initiatives? And perhaps I can add on another sort of half question to that, which is about the potential for it to scale. So if we do see rising labour shortages after the aforementioned B word, what's the potential? How large could it go?
I'll take the first part, which is similar models. I'm not aware of any. I know that in terms of the way that I'll say the UK works in general, then Concordia has taken to an extra level is obviously everyone that we work with has a GLA license, so the Gang Licensed Labour Abuse Authority. So we are licensed by the Home Office, in essence, by the government, to say that we are clean, that we work well, we work legally. And every single partner that we have overseas has exactly the same license, and they are not allowed to even speak to anyone before they have this license because they represent us. So that is how we work, and how I know other labour providers have to work, because no license means no recruitment in the UK. So in that sense, there are similar models. We take it a step further in that we try and ensure that we don't just follow the legal model, we follow the ethical model. To make sure that all of our audits, all of the people we work with follow the ETI base code. We make sure that all of the GLA is taken to the extra level, not just the legal level, the highly recommended level and the preferred levels, and that kind of thing. So that's as hard as we push. We do our very best to make that really our number one drive. The second part of this question was about scale. Now, we hoped that the pilot would be extended, so we'd be recruiting, rather than 1,250, we'd be recruiting 5,000. It was aligned in the Conservative Party manifesto. It then went very, very quiet. So we had about 4 hours extra notice than the rest of the country on this change to the immigration plan, although clearly we were hoping for and had planned for it. It is scalable. It takes time to scale because every single person that comes to the UK via Concordia has a face-to-face interview. Every single person is checked in terms of their motivation. Every single farm where a worker goes to, we go through all sorts of checks, risk assessments, health and safety checks, audits, if we haven't worked with them before, and even if we have done, we'll still go in and check all of this. So it's not a quick and easy way to grow because we put so many checks in. However, to go to 5,000 this year is perfectly possible. To go much further, bearing in mind that what I said in my introduction was we needed 90,000 roles filled. At the moment, you have 2 operators of a pilot. if we want to go from 10,000 this year to possibly 60,000 people filling 90,000 roles, that can't be done with 2 people, and we do need other people to be tested to make sure that their way of working also works. So yes, it's scalable. It will be tricky to get to 90,000 roles filled, I think, at short notice.
Thank you very much. Kate, we have a couple of design questions here that I'm going to group together. One observes that the UK scheme requires non-EU workers to pay their own visa costs, and the question is about what the practice is in other countries. And then the second question is about this issue of whether or not work permits are tied to particular employers or whether or not workers can move around. So the example given by the questioner is about Canada, which has recognized that this can be a key determinant of abuse or exploitation, and therefore it's instituted an open work permit for at-risk workers.
Sure. So in terms of visa costs, yes, you may be required to cover visa costs, and any other big expense can be travel costs, and that can vary a little bit by country. So in some cases, there may be a requirement for the employer to split the cost of travel with the seasonal worker. In some cases, the seasonal worker themselves may be liable for that cost, or in some cases, the employer may cover the entire cost of travel, which is a consideration. I mean, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, accruing that kind of debt can be a little bit prohibitive, especially if you're recruiting from a much lower income country. So that's worth thinking about. In terms of the mobility of workers, so countries that are signatory to the Seasonal Workers Directive, so that's not the UK, sadly, but most other European countries signed up to the directive, and one of the terms in the directive is that seasonal workers should be able to switch employers under certain conditions. So it is an employer-linked permit, but there are provisions to move to another employer if need be. I mean, again, the issue here is that if that switch is basically done by seasonal workers under their own steam, the question then is how easy is that for them to do in practice? If you don't speak the host country's language, if you don't have many networks, there's a little bit of a question mark whether you would actually, within that, say, 6-month period, be able to find another source of employment and move, or whether you'd rather just stick it out for that period. So I think that's one question that will be quite interesting to focus on as the EU reviews some of its seasonal worker programs later this year, is the extent to which this is actually, a provision that could be used practically by seasonal workers.
Thank you very much, Kate. Jan, we have a question here about the data limitations. So as a researcher, how difficult is it to get a sense of the sort of scale of seasonal migration? I mean, the problem with intra-EU mobility, particularly short-term, is that it often kind of floats below the radar. So are governments in a position where they can identify where labour needs are and who is moving to take up these jobs, or are there sort of significant data limitations that you've faced?
Yeah, thank you for the question. In fact, it is the latter. There is significant data limitations at this moment, and these limitations came about, ironically, with that mega development of the Central and Eastern European countries accessing the European Union and becoming part of it as citizens are under the free movement and free labor regime from that moment on. And they are sort of beyond the radar of any authorities, which usually have to do with issuing visas or with checking the employment conditions as a prerequisite for any visa or residence title. So these people can be on the private market, be referred, be transferred, or applying themselves directly on German farms for work. So we are relying right now with very rough numbers on a survey that is done among agricultural enterprises every few years only. So the last survey of that so-called Agrarstrukturerhebung, agricultural structural survey, is from 2016. So figures are more than 3 years old. And That's how we find out how many people in the German agricultural industry are working as part of their families. Still a great part of farms in Germany is small and middle scale farms with members of the family working there. It's less than 1/3. We have, as I mentioned, about 1/3 of employees are seasonal workers who are hired exclusively for the time of harvesting. The remainder is regularly employed, more or less full or part-time positions, which are subject to Social Security contributions. So there is, at the moment, significant limitations in data availability. Of course, we have some data which result from the procedural statistics of institutions such as the customs units who are doing the inspections on the fields to look at a black market phenomena and so forth. But of course, they are not even covering a fraction of the enterprises there. So again, here no reliable data. We are relying a lot on qualitative data gathered actually from those different counseling services that are out on the fields every spring and summer, meeting the workers out there. But naturally, they cannot tell us anything about the scope of the workforce from particular countries or particular areas of those countries. And bottom line is that from the moment onwards that Germany might start to implement placement agreements with the labor authorities of third countries, subject to a procedure which might look maybe similar to that in the UK Concordia example, which I really admire and which I was happy to learn about in the report that I only read recently, is that we will have a greater amount of figures, hopefully in the future, at least on the migration of seasonal workers from third countries. So at the moment, the data situation is not sufficient, but we hope that at least with regard to third country migration in the future, we'll have more decent data. And by the way, also more opportunities both for authorities, but also for civil society and counseling organizations to deliver their services and to safeguard proper and decent and fair labor conditions for those who are working on the fields and guaranteeing that the Germans have their strawberries and their asparagus on the table.
Thank you very much, Jan. I'm glad you ended with an optimistic note as a researcher too. Stephanie, I have a question here that picks up on the points you were making in your last intervention about potential shortages and current shortages. The UK government's new immigration plan makes reference to the fact that employers should invest in ways to improve productivity, so whether it's technology or training, as an alternative to previous reliance on low-wage labour. What are the potentials for technology in agriculture and horticulture, and is this a kind of reasonable strategy as well to try and mitigate rising shortages?
It's definitely reasonable to put on the table. I think the first thing is, I think agriculture in general and in Britain specifically, which is where I know best, gets a bad press for not driving efficiency. We are getting paid as a sector the same, if not less, per kilo of crop than 12 years ago, 10 years ago. There's been absolutely no change in anything apart from potentially a little bit of eggs and a little bit of chicken. So if you're producing fruit, veg or meat in the UK, you're being paid the same as you were 10 years ago. You're doing that with fewer workers who are working similar hours. So in terms of efficiency, the sector has done a cracking job in driving efficiency already. That's in different ways of working, different crop yields, etc. So I think that's the first point to sort of put on the table, that actually the sector has done a really good job so far, and we shouldn't sort of put that to one side. In terms of improved productivity and machines, not my personal area of expertise, although a lot of work has been done on this. The more we look into it, we are a good 5 to 10 years away from anything being really seen regularly in the fields. Some crops are easier to pick than others. For example, if you think of blackcurrant, we just literally send a machine down, it rips out the bush is then kind of sorted, the berries go off to make Ribena, pretty much, and the rest of the bush is got rid of. There is a driver needed, that is it. Potatoes, again, very, very low need for humans to interact. When you're talking about picking asparagus, you're almost entirely human-led because, I mean, it's growing at 4 centimetres a day. You can almost see it growing, and you need to pick at exact moments, at exact cutting points, etc. And the same with strawberries. You could be sorting them into maybe 10, 15 different sizes, different colours, different shapes. So, I mean, you can't have someone that's colourblind, and again, we're struggling to find machines that can check that kind of level. So absolutely more can be done, and lots of investment is going in. We're talking about a sector that doesn't have an awful lot to put into this. Labour was about 6% of their bills. If we sort of put it that way, it's now creeping a lot closer to 65, 66%. So there are no margins left really to do a lot of research into this, although some are doing a good job. So I suppose to summarise is a lot's been done. There's a lot still to do. It is an answer, but you will still need labour to do the rest of it around the machine. So some of it will help. We won't ever get away from the need to have large numbers of seasonal workers.
Thank you so much. That's really fascinating. And Kate, we have a question here, which is kind of the second half of why shortages emerge, which is about why countries rely on foreign workers to meet their seasonal labour needs. Why is it so difficult to recruit locally, and what do you think it would take to reduce reliance on foreign seasonal labour, and is that a goal that countries should be aspiring to?
So I think there are a few different factors that come in here. I think one is, I think that it's difficult to recruit for several reasons. I think one is that it can be comparatively low wages. Sometimes these jobs are in quite remote locations. You can have quite labour-intensive roles with irregular hours, not that much security in the job, and so it's a really sort of short-term, temporary nature. So I think all of those factors can play into why it can be really hard to recruit people locally. There's often just people may not have experience in that particular field. So if you're choosing between trying to hire locally or recruiting workers who have that specific experience in harvesting a crop, it's much more appealing to go for the worker who has that experience as well. So I think, there are quite a few sort of structural reasons why it can be quite difficult to hire locally. Making these jobs more appealing to locals is challenging because, that would require doing something like increasing wages or reducing the hours or the intensity of the work. But the trade-off here is that it raises costs. And in some of these industries that have very low, margins, that's just not really tenable. And then, of course, if employers still can't find workers, this is maybe where automation and robotics comes in. That, again, it's sort of, as Stephanie said, it's that sort of 5 to 10 year perspective. It's about, investing in the research there. So I think there isn't in practice that much flexibility to really sort of respond to local hiring challenges unless you really sort of reevaluated how much people are willing to pay for these services or for these goods.
Thank you, Kate. Jan, we have a question here about the children of seasonal workers, which is making the point that in the United States, a child of a seasonal worker would have citizenship of the US. What is the situation in Germany, and is this a consideration? I mean, the classic thing that's often said about Germany was that guest worker programs, several decades ago actually became permanent migration vehicles because people wanted to have families or bring their families. What is the situation now?
Well, if you're referring to seasonal work in agriculture, the situation has basically been that this migration is rather strictly limited due to an indirect steering mechanism, and that indirect steering mechanism refers to those working hours not being subject to Social Security contributions if they are less than 70 days in a given year. So 95 or even 99% of seasonal workers employed now in German agriculture have a maximum stay in Germany of 70 days. As I mentioned, right now 95% of the seasonal work taking place is mobility within the European Union. A downside of it might be, and we have isolated cases and examples for that, that there is mothers or fathers going to Germany for a couple of weeks in the summer, leaving their children with either the other parent or with grandparents or with relatives. That is a frequently observed sort of downside of seasonal migration, also in different contexts worldwide, as we know. There is usually not much sense in taking children along as they are in their institutions like kindergarten and schooling back home. If you refer to the situation of foreign labor in German agriculture in full jobs or in part-time jobs, which are subject to social security contributions and which, by the way, are regulated and subject to the Residence Act with a big reform just in front of our door starting as of March. Of course, for skilled labor in agriculture or in other professions and sectors, there's an opportunity on the basis primarily of European law for family reunification, but this does not apply to seasonal work. And maybe allow me one very short comment on the two former aspects that Stephanie and Kate mentioned. As far as the recruitment of locals is concerned, Germany has a good tradition of trying to avoid recruiting labor from other countries in that area, even supporting employment of the locally unemployed, short-term or long-term unemployed in times in the 1980s when unemployment reached 10, 12, or even 15% in some regions. And those programs desperately failed. And if you go on a German asparagus field in summer, among 100 people working there, you might find one German. And I recently visited one of the asparagus growers there. It's just a result of the fact that this is dire and very hard work, which, by the way, requires in a lot of different cultures particular skills. And it's not by coincidence that it is Thai berry pickers who go out into the fields in Sweden, one of the great examples of our joint case study with MPI. It is not by coincidence that people from particular countries of origin, where this knowledge is also given to other people, are the source of that seasonal work. And it's basically the same with some of the cultures in agriculture in Germany. I've mentioned asparagus, but of course grapes and wine is the second big example for that, where agricultural enterprises rely on the proven workforce and skills of people from the same region from year to year.
Thank you so much, Jan. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today. I think this has been a really rich and fascinating discussion. Thanks to our speakers, really fascinating interventions, but also some really great questions from the audience. So thank you so much for those, and apologies if we didn't get to any of those. We'll follow up with you directly afterwards. Just to point you again to some resources on our website. The audio from today will be available later at migrationpolicy.org/events. Kate's report, Seasonal Worker Programs in Europe, is available at the link on your screens right now or on the homepage of our website. And the other reports from the SVR MPI Europe Research Project, Legal Migration for Work and Training, is also available on that link on your screens right now. For any reporters on the call who'd like some more information, please call Michelle at +44 20 8123 6265 if you're in Europe, or if you're in the States, 202 266 1910. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.